We have an hour here with two guests who are rejoining us here. We're going to talk with Christopher Hitchens of Vanity Fair. Good morning.
Morning.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
And we're going to talk with David Frum, an author and a member of the Manhattan Institute. Good morning to you.
Thank you.
What are you reading today?
Well, the first story that caught my eye was the story that was in both the Washington Post and the Washington Times. A team of Columbia University researchers has come up with some disturbing findings about the rising incidence of child poverty. This is one of these stories that is a profound trend in American life, but somehow never seems newsworthy enough to actually break through the usual noise of the broad trends. Here's what they found. The percentage of children in poverty is up sharply over the past 20 years, and numbers here are probably better than statistics. That in 1975 there were 3.5 million children living in poverty, and today there are 6 million children living in poverty. Now what's striking, and the reason to look at both stories, is that the two newspapers implicitly give, the Washington Post and the Washington Times, different explanations of why this is so. And in a way,
this is the Times story we're looking at, by the way.
Okay. And in a way it sort of sums up a lot of the ideological debate in America about what is going wrong with the country. The Washington Post story follows the Columbia researchers in believing that the main problem is the declining rate of pay, at least that's available to the less skilled, that it's more difficult for less skilled people to find work, so they are poor and therefore their children are poor. The Washington Times story emphasizes that it's family status that has everything to do with it, that of the children who are poor, only 8% of poor children live with a married mother and father. 92% live either with parents who are living together common law, which is usually a very short-term arrangement, or in single-parent households. And so that you've got the statistical evidence, the facts right there, to come up with whichever view you like. Is that child poverty is a result of changes in the labor market? Child poverty is the result of changes in American family structure.
Christopher Hitchens, I'll give you a chance to respond to that, and you have a different interest this morning as well.
Got to be said that there's something superficially plausible about shortage of money as an explanation for poverty, though, I think. I mean, I've always felt, I mean, and given all the I won't give it its right name, all the nonsense talked about family values, or the incessant stress placed on them, it is still a pretty amazing reproach that the number of children living in absolute poverty should be going up in the way that it has done. In Sweden a few years ago, the country I think probably most disliked by the American right, maybe even more than Cuba, I sometimes think, it was found that you could take a child out of a class in any school at random and run the ruler over it, its teeth, its skin, its calcium, rate of growth, and all that kind of thing. And having run the ruler over it, you could make no guess at all about the social class or occupation of its parents. That's what I would call a social democratic achievement. Imagine how far one is in America from being able to do that. You can tell more or less at a glance what the social class or origins of a lot of people are. Just a thought. I must say I don't think it's necessarily an antithesis what you put forward at the opening. Because poverty is very often a cause of family breakup, as is joblessness among males. And I think that it may be a distinction without a difference to suggest that one is a cultural and one is a social cause of misery among our children.
Actually, but family breakup seems to be bigger than that there were 7.5 million children altogether born out of wedlock in the United States last year, many of them to non-poor people. I agree with Christopher Hitchens. This is maybe one of the top 2 or 3 things that Americans should be worrying about. I mean, that a quarter of the country's children are growing up poor, and as Christopher Hitchens says, that means that they're never going to be as tall. That means they're never going to be as clever because they're not fed properly when they're young. I mean, it has huge implications for the society. And
they're not going to be very good parents either.
And they're not going to be very good parents.
Let's get some more issues and more articles on the table here, but first we want to re-invite the viewers to phone in with their questions, comments, anything they're seeing in their papers around the country. We'll put the split lines on the screen again for you. Talk for a couple more minutes and then start taking your phone calls. Our guests this morning are David Frum, who is the author of this book right here. It's titled What's Right? Came out earlier this year, right? How's it doing?
It's doing actually not too bad. I say that with sort of a pleasant surprise. I always expect that these things are going to vanish without a trace, but it seems to be selling in its niche reasonably briskly.
I prefer the title of the last one, I must say. Which was, by the way, dead right.
That's right.
And Christopher...
Which I always kept hoping would be more prescient than it actually was.
Now, you, Christopher Hitchens, just got back from overseas.
I did.
Where were you, and why did you go?
Well, actually, it's not all that. Last week, just before Thanksgiving, I was in Cyprus, which I think is a very important subject, very much off the American radar screen at the moment, but I predict about to come back. The situation in Cyprus is deteriorating, I believe. The overall rivalry between Greece and Turkey is intensifying, but the situation in Cyprus itself is intensifying independently. The Turkish position is becoming much harder. They've just adopted what I would describe as a shoot-to-kill policy against people who protest against the Turkish partition of the island. 3 people were killed over the summer in cold blood as a result. And it's one of those stories that everyone feels they know and has been filed away on them. Actually, you can't file something on a back burner, can you? But you know what I mean. Has been stored and looked like a permanent petrified stalemate, but in fact the stalemate is becoming unstable, and so I went to have a look at that and try and update my book on the subject.
And you mentioned that it's sort of a small arms build-up among 2 NATO countries.
Yes, there's a local arms race going on, which should concern your viewers probably more than it does, in that the United States is the principal supplier of heavy weaponry to both sides. Both of the rivals in this case are members of the NATO alliance, and the United States, as the biggest exporter of military hardware around the world, is the armorer of both. In fact, it also ought to be better known, in my opinion, that Turkey violates the United States Foreign Assistance Act by using aid and military material given to it for its own defense for the occupation and colonization of northern Cyprus.
And we know you have an article that you brought to the table here out of Zaire this morning. What's on your mind?
Yes, sorry, still to keep people overseas, but another thing that surprises me, because it's a thing one could have seen coming at least a year ago, is the implosion of the Mobutu regime in Zaire. Probably the worst regime in probably the richest, potentially most successful country in Africa. And once again, very much United States responsibility. General Mobutu was imposed upon Zaire by the Central Intelligence Agency a long time ago. He and his army and his appalling regime are our business, and they've got a very short time now, I would say, to live or to survive. Live in the case of Mobutu because he's dying of cancer, and survive in the case of the regime because it is a one-man despotism, and its army is trained only to fight its own civilians and is now gradually collapsing in the eastern provinces as the rebels get nearer the capital. If I was Mr. Anthony Lake, I would be calling urgent briefings at my new CIA to find out what went wrong and begin the inquest now.
Stay overseas just for a minute here. Actually, it's the Chinese defense minister was in town yesterday, made a speech, got a pretty decent amount of coverage, front page in the Washington Times here. This gentleman defended the 1989 attack on Tiananmen Square and actually claimed no one was killed in the bloody confrontation, as he points out here. Any response to what you've seen?
It's all a big misunderstanding. I have to say that I would, if I were a front page editor, I would not put Chinese, I would not regard Chinese communist thinks it's okay to kill people as a front page story. That strikes me as a dog bites man story. If you found a Chinese communist who thought it wasn't okay to kill people, that would be a front page story.
I'm amazed at the hold that the Chinese seem to be able to exert over Washington, and the way that this must be the 3rd administration running that they've managed to humiliate, that's come into office saying, look, we really do intend to make human rights a priority in our China policy, and then has reversed itself. Now we have to, apparently this guy got quite a warm reception wherever he spoke too, was treated, you know, as an honored guest. I think it's a bit much.
He was, according to this article, shunned by most Republican members of Congress, though, during a breakfast reception on Capitol Hill that was
attended. Well, that's probably because it's the Democrats' turn to be groveling to China. It would have been the other way around if it had been the Bush administration.
What else are you reading?
The Republican Party won control of the Texas State Senate for the first time since Reconstruction. That's a story on page 2 of this morning's Washington Post. I think it's in the Washington Times as well.
Got the Times story here.
This is big news. Governor George Bush in Texas is planning a run for the presidency in the year 2000, as I understand. I don't think it's generally understood how weak the Texas governor is. He's one of the weakest governors in America. There's very little that he can actually do to, I mean, the lieutenant governor turns out to be actually a more powerful person in many ways than the governor. But Texas is a state run by its legislature, and the Democratic Party has managed to stave off defeat in Texas for a long, long time. I think the tide has now turned. It is a reminder of how epiphenomenal the whole Clinton presidency is. That the Clinton presidency, from the Democratic point of view, is sort of like getting your teeth capped while your gums are rotting. That the top of the ticket is still there, there's still a Democratic Party on top, but all the way down, that the Democratic Party is decomposing before our eyes. There's a lot of optimistic talk among Democrats at the time of the election. Christopher Hitchens, I guess you'd call him corporate colleague, Sidney Blumenthal, who writes for the New Yorker, a sister publication of Vanity Fair, suggested that the story here is that the Republican Party is disintegrating, and that we've now got this new Democratic coalition. In fact, this is evidence of the underlying strength of the Republican Party and the underlying weakness of the Democrats.
I like the idea of being a corporate colleague of Sidney's, and I'm a great fan of his. But I must say that I'm inclined to agree with you that the success of Clinton depends more or less on the defeat of his party. That he more or less explicitly campaigned for Clinton-Gingrich '92, and that's of course what he got. But I mean, he didn't campaign at all to try and get the Democratic control of Congress back. Didn't mention it in his convention speech. Didn't mention it on the campaign trail. Really, I think had internalized the idea that he owed his recovery as a president to the defeat of his party by Gingrich in '94, and. The Texas thing may not be the symptom of that you suggest, but there's nothing wrong with your underlying analysis. The Texas thing could also be, I suppose, taken as a symptom of something else that's long-term, the southernization of the GOP.
The president will be speaking to his party, or at least a section of the party today, about 12:15. We'll have this speech here on C-SPAN to the Democratic Leadership Council. It's a group that he once headed. Gerald Seib in the Wall Street Journal today. This will be the most serious policy speech Mr. Clinton gives between his election and his inauguration, so it bears watching for signs of what is to come in the next 4 years.
The DLC is the living refutation of all those who believe that Clinton is a closet liberal. I mean, he began his political career helping to found an organization that wanted to move the Democratic Party to the right. And he's now moved not just the party but the entire country to the right in a way that probably no Republican could have managed in such a short time. So they'll have lots to talk about when they get together.
Well, he sort of has this strange, almost sick relationship with the right wing of his party. He returns to them periodically for strength, and then he forgets about them and drifts away. And that he will periodically make these trips of contrition and reunification with the DLC. That he had a big meeting with them after the 1994 election. I think that was his first big speech, was to the DLC again. Then he forgot about them for a while, and now he's been reelected. Now he returns, I think that they're like. It's like some Victorian saga about the mother of a bad boy, and he always shows up when he's in trouble on mother's steps, weeping and wailing, and she takes him in and gives him a meal, and then he's off again back to the saloons. And I think that is, I wouldn't say that President Clinton is a liberal. On the other hand, I think it's exactly the same kind of mistake to say that he's a right-wing Democrat as it is to say that he's a left-wing Democrat.
Can't think what saloons you're talking about.
Oh, the flesh pots of liberalism.
Go on.
Yes. Well,
what would be his most conspicuous recent visit there, would you say?
Well, I mean,
I do know what you mean by saloons and flesh pots, but
well, for example, he gave his a big black tie address to the DLC after the 1994 election, in which he said he would be a good boy and not indulge in irresponsible politics and do the kinds of things they believed in. The thing they probably believe in more than anything else is getting control of the budget, making sure that bring the entitlements problem under control, and getting America's long-term fiscal balance in order. What Clinton then spent the next 18 months doing was fighting the Medicare battle in a way that is going to make it immensely more difficult to achieve any of the reforms that the DLC believes in, and that he has won the presidency on a slogan, no changes to Medicare. Well, there are going to be changes in Medicare. There must be changes in Medicare, and DLC people believe that more than anybody. And yet he himself, by the way he fought his election campaign, the way he outmaneuvered the Republicans in the last Congress, has made it extraordinarily difficult to achieve that. Now he's there for absolution, and is promising that in his second term he is going to do exactly what he promised not to do in the last 18 months of his first term.
And the reversal on the balanced budget amendment must be worth any number of what anyone understands to be election year remarks about Medicare. In the, well, if you're totting up ideological evolution, I think it is.
Headline in the Wall Street Journal concerning balanced budget, as Mr. Hitchens pointed out, balanced budget amendment is up for grabs over on Capitol Hill, in House at least, while support strengthens in the Senate. We've got a lot more we want to bring to the table, but we do want to get some of the viewers involved here. Our first call for David Frum and Chris Hitchens, Dover, Delaware. Thanks for hanging on. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi.
Yeah, good morning. I'd like to make a couple comments. One is that I've worked in the hospitals for almost 20 years. I'm an anesthetist, and I've participated in abortions, and as far as giving anesthesia for individuals who needed them. I've never seen one partial birth abortion in 20 years. I've seen instances where the gynecologist has made a wrong determination, and the lady is later on in the birth, than we realized, and they've used saline injections, generally speaking, to deliver these babies that are, closer to full term. But the only time I've ever seen a baby dissected was when they thought that the child was much earlier than he was, and they'd already started the abortion procedure, and they had to remove it then because it was already dead. That's the one thing. The other thing is that the abortion rights people would spend more time trying to help the living children who need help. As you've indicated earlier, the number of poor children in this country is increasing. No one seems to care about them. They're worried about children who are not even here. So let's take care of what we have right here, and maybe we can deal with this other problem later.
All right, Paul.
I'm willing to take that as a comment. It didn't seem to be a question.
Yeah, I'll just throw this one thought out. I don't think it's true that that not enough abortions is the reason that there are more and more children living in poverty. And even if it were, I don't think that it would be the best solution to the problem of the increase of the number of children in poverty to recommend aborting more of them.
Let's go to Potomac, Maryland, our next call. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi.
I'd just like to ask two questions, actually. Does the Republican gentleman there, does he support the Chinese actions right now with the different things that's going on in China?
Well, I'm not if that's directed to me, I'm not really much of a Republican. I don't know how the caller would think that that the actions of the Chinese Communist government are in some way or other the fault or the responsibility of the Republican Party.
Caller, you want to respond to that? You still there?
Yes. I didn't quite get the last piece of my answer. What? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the Republican Party is the Republican Party is the ideologically anti-communist party that is always being attacked for its, in fact, inflexible and rigid attitude on questions like communism. So I don't know that I don't know that there are very many Republicans who would endorse the actions of the Chinese government.
Well, I guess I really didn't ask the right question. What I really had in my head was the one-child policy that they have in China.
Okay. We understand, caller.
Which is a very fascinating policy, because if you think about it, it means that in a generation or so there would be no realistic word for brother or sister, which would be a very odd thing for a communist society to find that it had created. Not to mention the thought of a society of 1 billion people all made up of only children. By the way, talking of that, you see that Freud's come back in Russia. Lenin was very keen on Freud, and started after the Bolshevik Revolution to encourage psychoanalysis among Soviet citizens. Stalin thought that it was bad, and no doubt had Oedipal reasons of his own for repressing it, completely banning it, and now it's been legalized again, psychoanalysis in Russia. But they're going to need it in China if they have a billion only children and not just no word for brother and sister, but no word for aunt or uncle quite soon. So the fraternity bit of liberty, equality, and fraternity will be down the tubes.
What else you got your eye on today?
One other thing. In that same front page below the fold, the merger of St. Luke's, I guess it isn't below the fold, of St. Luke's and Beth Israel Hospital in New York.
It is.
Again, this is more of a trend story than a big news story, but it's an example of how, since 1993, and amazingly enough, coinciding with the defeat of the so-called Clinton reform, that American medicine through the marketplace has completely reinvented itself. Now, a lot of the reinvention has been experimental and innovative, and there have been a lot of disappointments and failures along the way. But in fact, exactly the problem that President Clinton campaigned in 1992 on, and saying that only government could solve, that is, the rise in medical costs and the shrinkage of the number of people covered by private health insurance, is in its sort of crude, lumbering, often brutal way being directly handled by the American marketplace. That costs have come down. The rate of medical inflation has fallen to below 4% over the past 3 years. Americans are switching from traditional medicine to HMOs. As a result, the number of people who are losing their coverage is being stabilized. And stories like this are just sort of give us periodic glimpses of a marketplace that is being reinvented in a creative way. And it warns us that just as we now see that the 1993 Clinton health plan would have aborted a lot of these important changes, that we have to be very wary of what the president plans in his second term. He again plans to monkey, this time in a more cynical and opportunistic and less coherent way than in the first term with the American healthcare marketplace. And again, this should be stopped. There are always going to be horror stories when you have a marketplace that is churning and reinventing itself as rapidly as this one. But on the whole, this is a story of tremendous creativity and dynamism, and it should not be interfered with.
Any thoughts?
You're Canadian, aren't you? Are you a refugee from the single payer? Do you consider yourself to be?
The summary line on the Canadian health care system is Canada is a great place to be when you're not sick. That if you twist your ankle, I'd much rather twist my ankle in Toronto than in Washington. I go to a hospital, the doctor looks at me, I come out again, no paperwork, no forms to fill out. If, however, I'm sick, if I need an MRI, if I need a CAT scan, if I need a world-level surgeon, I would much rather be in the United States than in Canada. That for all its bureaucracy and inefficiencies and inconveniences, the American system does do a better job of providing high technological medicine than the Canadian. There are more, I think there are more CAT scan machines in metropolitan Washington than in all of Canada.
Well, the United States is a richer country too, but I mean, as someone who was brought up in, I can't believe that one couldn't close the technical gap without compromising the principle of healthcare. I mean, I think it's just extraordinary that this country and South Africa are the only countries that can be described as advanced, which don't have a national health provision of some kind or another. And my experiences with it here seem to have persuaded me, at any rate, that they combine the worst of capitalism with the worst of socialism. I mean, you can turn up, and if you haven't got a Visa card on you, they'll send you away. But the amount of paperwork and bureaucracy and paper shuffling and duplication of work that's involved in doing it is absolutely terrifying and would disgrace a Stalinist banana republic. And yet it's all for profit.
How's that compared to England, by the way?
Britain has a national health. Health treatment is a right in Britain. And it's the one thing of the post, one aspect, the one achievement, I should better say, of the post-war Labour government that not even Mrs. Thatcher dared to touch.
I don't know about the British situation. The way I would compare the United States and Canada is in Canada, we have these immense queues for all kinds of important operations. Everyone has insurance in Canada, but not everybody gets care. In the United States, it turns out almost everybody gets care, although many people lack insurance. So there's a choice. I won't defend the American system. It's obviously, it does combine the worst of both. It's also, by the way, a system in which the government looms very large. That's the cause of a lot of the problems. The federal government is the single largest purchaser of health care in the United States. But as this story shows, the private market has tremendous creative potential in the United States, and it should be let free.
Well, the private market certainly knows how to do mergers, but I felt I knew that already.
About a half hour left with David Frum and Chris Hitchens. Aurora, Illinois, you've been hanging on. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Hitchens. Two quick questions, then my point. Can you give me your opinion of the De Leon-inspired Socialist Labor Party? Number 2, you recall earlier in the year the SEC investigated the NASDAQ market makers for corruption. I was hoping you or your friend over at Counterpoint, Alexander Comer, could look into the market makers equivalent on the New York Stock Exchange, the specialists. I've heard they are deeply corrupt and have massive conflicts of interest. Now, there's a wonderful article in the newest edition of the Progressive magazine by Elaine Rapping called Burrowing Within that addresses the cult of individualism. I spoke with you once and suggested that far more of a threat than the religious right is the Ayn Rand-inspired libertarian right. What makes them so insidious is that under the guise of self-help and therapy, they spread their deeply ideological pro-corporate message consisting chiefly of the lie that life is what you make it, when anyone who's ever had a Walmart or McDonald's come to town or worked inside these fascist multinationals knows the opposite is true, that life under capitalism is what corporations make it. And Mr. Frum, I would have to say that the government of China is about as communist as Pat Robertson is a Christian. Thank you.
It's a lot out there. Go ahead and react.
There's a very high standard of call for this time of the morning. I mean, not, but it's. I think it's the opening bit is a little arcane for some people. Daniel De Leon was a great American socialist, rather dogmatic, rather schematic, thought by some, who ran for president on the Socialist Labour ticket, and founded a party which still bears that name, which still produces a socialist weekly called, I believe, The People. James Connolly, the great Irish Republican socialist revolutionary who was murdered by the British after the Easter Rising, got his early training in Daniel De Leon's party. But let me see. On the NASDAQ, I'll have to pass. I'm sorry, I just don't know enough about the SEC and NASDAQ, and I missed that story. As for what you ask about Ayn Rand and her influence on the American right, I think it's extremely interesting. There is a strain of, I'm sure a lot of people watching this have read either Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead, and perhaps imbibed some of the Randian doctrine, which is best summarized, I think, in her book, The Virtue of Selfishness. I've always thought it quaint and rather touching that there is in America a movement that thinks that people are not yet selfish enough. And I've met some of its supporters. They call themselves objectivists. And I've debated with them, but I've never got to the bottom of that problem. They think that really America is a society already rotten with too much socialism and compassion. And it's just so refreshing to meet people who manage to get through their day actually believing that.
The discussion here is getting very broad in terms of issues. What do you folks look for when you pick up the paper in the morning? What
do I look for?
Yeah.
I look for the style section, actually. It's always kind of a fight to get hold of it. I'm ashamed to admit that.
No, I became a journalist because I didn't want to have to rely on the newspapers for information. And I can't imagine what it's like for people who only do get their information that way. I mean, I get all my information, I think, from talking to other people in Washington. I read it basically for entertainment. And I follow the op-ed pages pretty closely, too.
The reason I asked the question is because there's a story about what's hot on the radio. We covered an event by Talkers Magazine yesterday. I wanted to compare your top 10 to this top 10. These are what radio talk show hosts say are the 10 hottest topics. We'll go right down the list and have you add or subtract from your own list. Presidential and local elections, quote, scandal gates of several varieties, crash of TWA Flight 800, Olympic bombing, the value jet crash, Unabomber, life on Mars, the Army sex scandal, the O.J. Simpson trial, and Texaco's racial problems. Whoops. Compare and contrast there to your list in terms of interest.
A half a dozen of them, or about half of them, I can't imagine what there is. I can't imagine what there is to say about the value jet crash, for example, that would fill up time on the radio. That it's a terrible thing. But I think that unless it's part of some kind of conspiracy worldview, like as I think has happened to the TWA.
No, surely it's to do with the fact that people on the staff of ValueJet were warning us before this crash that there were terrible corners being cut. Wouldn't that be the thing?
Well, I don't know what I don't know what the
corners being cut. I mean, maintenance corners being cut.
Yeah, I don't know if that's exactly why it is that this is so exciting to the people on talk radio.
I would move life on Mars much higher up the list.
Number one? Not quite?
Well, over some local elections I would. Yeah, actually, no, I think it's up. I read a book once by a man I do look for in the paper is John Noble Wilford, the science writer of the Times, the New York Times, who wrote a wonderful book called Mars Beckons about the possibility not that there is life on Mars, but that life could be created there, that the conditions for it exist, and that by seeding Mars, do I look like a complete crackpot when I'm saying this? That by seeding Mars with nitrous oxide and so on, you could create clouds which would one day create rain, which would one day create life. This is a real possibility, apparently. Absolutely enthralling work. That one could organize a genesis moment for Mars, and then stand back.
I hope Wilfred doesn't talk to his economic colleagues at the New York Times about this, because they'd be worried about what this would mean for the trade deficit.
And I was also, I must say, I was kind of thrilled to find that there may be water on the moon, after all. Or at least ice, therefore possibly water. Because it means we won't have to take any there. And that possibly something of a similar process could be inaugurated up there, too.
Let's get some more calls in. Bel Air, Maryland. You're next. Bel Air, go ahead.
Good morning.
Morning.
My question is, or my comments are for Mr. Frum, who seems to have some nasty things to say about the Canadian health care. I recently attended a wedding in Connecticut, and most of the guests were from Canada. And while they were there, the mother of one of the guests had fallen and broken a hip. Now, the extent of the medical care in Canada is such that this woman didn't even feel compelled to run home. There was instant medical care and home care available to her. So I'd also like to point out recently, a couple of years ago, Mr. Tsongas, ex-Senator Tsongas, made a comment that if he'd had his condition, which required bone marrow transplant, in Canada he would have died. I think he failed to mention that the procedure for bone marrow transplant was perfected in Canada. There was nobody there at that wedding. I took that occasion to bring up the state of medical care in Canada, and everybody raved about it. I would also point out to Mr. Frum that his comment about the horrors of some of the abuses in our own system are not as anecdotal as you would seem to imply. 8,000 women were sent home the same day having a mastectomy. To me, that is not a minor horror story.
Mr. Frum?
Granted, it was a small percentage of the women, but that it should happen at all. I would also bring up the drive-by delivery situation.
Well,
Caller, let's get a response.
Well, I think that the drive-by delivery is sort of an unfortunate, actually, comparison, because drive-by deliveries are now the rule in Canada, that everybody in Canada, unless you have an extreme condition, is sent home within 24 hours. Also, the babies are left in the room. They close in most of the, at least in most of the Toronto hospitals. I think this is the case in the poorer parts of Canada. They've closed the incubators, except for the high-risk babies. You get the baby right away because there isn't money for nurses. I mean, it's true about Canadian medical research. I mean, there are a lot of brilliant people working in Canadian universities. But the Canadian medical situation is exactly what you would expect it to be in a society where you pay, an English-speaking society adjacent to the United States, where doctors are paid, and the more skilled they are, the more true this is, something between a third and one-half of what their American counterparts are paid, in which the only check on patients don't see a bill, so the only check on their use of the system is top-down administrative controls, and in which governments try to control costs by reducing the amount of technology in the system. It behaves exactly the way you would expect it to behave.
Lafayette, Louisiana, you're next.
Hello.
Hi.
Yes, I'd like to talk to Mr. Hitchens about the national health care in Britain. I don't know how you think it's wonderful. I'll just give you one example. My sister needed surgery for a hernia. It took 2 years before they finally admitted her. And if she couldn't have gone that day when they called, she would have to go on the list again, on the waiting list. They finally did the surgery on her. She was in terrible pain. They did what they called keyhole surgery over there. After 6 hours, she was still in surgery. He had to open her up and go in. And what he did was he ruptured her spleen, and he had to take her spleen out. And now she's on antibiotics for the rest of her life. Now, if she was in this country, she would be a millionaire. And I don't believe in suing doctors. But this is just one example of the national health care in Britain. My father died because of the national health care in Britain. We all say, wonderful, the doctors come to your house. They came to the house twice in the middle of the night for my father and ignored it. And by the time the GP came in the morning after his, quote, surgery hours, he was sent to the hospital, died in the ambulance with an aneurysm. So don't tell me it's wonderful the doctors have house calls. It doesn't mean a damn thing.
All right, caller. Tell us more about it.
I think I said initially that it's the only one of British Labour's post-war institutional accomplishments that even Mrs. Thatcher felt she couldn't challenge. But that doesn't mean to say that the service hasn't become extremely run down and hasn't had grave cuts inflicted on it. And I've heard, actually I can't say I've heard a story as bad as the one that the lady just told us. It sounds absolutely frightful. But I've heard stories not dissimilar, and more of them recently, as the service has been allowed to fall into disrepair, but it still upholds the principle that healthcare is a right and is available to all. And that principle is imperfectly observed. Doesn't seem to me to be a criticism of what I said at the outset.
We have a call from Central South Carolina. What's on your mind?
Yes, I have a comment and a question for Chris Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens, I have heard that you are an atheist, and I was wondering if that was true, because because I think you're much too intelligent to be an atheist, and you seem to have a really good heart, so I'm wondering why you don't believe in God. And I hope that you're not basing your concept of what Christianity is on the Pat Robertson model, because believe me, he does not speak for me, and I consider myself a born-again Christian, and he does and says a lot of things that are completely left field as far as I can tell. So I would encourage you to maybe look at a magazine like Sojourner. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's that model too of Christianity, and I'm wondering if you've ever considered that and how that affects your faith or lack thereof, if at all.
All right, Colin.
Well, you seem to have a good heart too, ma'am, though how you can tell about mine, I don't know. I would caution you not to judge a book by its cover. I have read Sojourners, and I've met the people who work there, and very nice they are too, but not even they will convince me that I owe my presence in this studio to a divine design. I don't believe I was divinely designed, nor do I believe I'm divinely supervised as I go about my daily tasks. I've decided that there's simply no reason to believe it, and so I don't.
I was rather looking forward to a conversion moment here on C-SPAN where Christopher Hitchens was going to...
It's blinded by the light. No, it's just, I just think that the whole hypothesis of us being created is now, I think that's very nearly, you can't, of course, totally disprove the existence of God. You can simply say there's no reason to believe in his or her existence. I think the idea of a divinity as the creator has now pretty much been, well, rendered unnecessary as an assumption. I mean, we have alternative explanations of how we got here, but it isn't really religious to say you believe that you're created. It's much more religious to say that you owe worship to someone who is supervising you and who takes an interest in your thoughts and your daily doings. I just find that quite impossible to believe and quite unnecessary to believe, and though it doesn't have to issue in superstition and bigotry and foolishness of the Pat Robertson kind, it makes a very good nursery for that sort of thing, because it's fundamentally solipsistic and narcissistic to believe that you are the adored object of a divinity.
Let's get Mr. Frum back in. Any other articles that you saw?
I think those were the big ones of the day. What seems to happen, I often wonder whether it's the supply of news that fluctuates or whether it's journalists' appetites for it. That I wonder whether, in fact, so many of the best journalists in America don't schedule holidays for the 2 weeks or 3 weeks immediately after an election, that you notice that your newspapers become very, very thin, and they become filled with stories like, I mean, with all due respect to Sigmund Freud, the front page story in the New York Times on the Russians rediscovering Freud, that had the feel of a story that was written maybe 3 months ago that was being saved for the day that all their political correspondents took their post-election holiday.
Would you classify this story in that category? We talked about this a little bit earlier.
No,
here.
This story is charming. This is really...
This is Dick Morris, the former aide to the president who left toward the end of the campaign there. He's pushing a book that he has out, and a picture here has him speaking to a class at NYU, New York University, in the city there, and he talks about his prescription for a comeback. 3 points. Number 1, apologize. You have to recognize your sins. Number 2, don't make excuses. And 3, consider yourself inoculated from further questions and criticism. And Susan Page writes that his comeback road is dauntingly uphill.
Well, that last sentence is much too optimistic. It isn't at all uphill. I mean, he's already back in the newspapers. No, I think he will be astonishingly easy. The essence of the Dick Morris method seems to be don't confuse the verbal formula of an apology with actual contrition. Because if you really were sorry, you wouldn't be able to help coming back to the subject again and again and again. But he seems to see it as a kind of like amulet. You say, I'm sorry, and that's it, the subject is closed. And then you tell the reporter from USA Today, with 5 million readers, when they ask you a further question, the American people aren't interested in this. And you think, well, the people at USA Today must have some expertise in what the American people are interested in. They sell 5 million newspapers to them every day. But he is what Emerson called a representative man. I think he's just one of the most characteristic figures of our time, and he's fascinating.
New York Times following that story as well. Chris Hitchens, any reaction?
Comeback, I didn't think he'd even been away. I mean, by the way, he's another instance of what I mean about the president. I mean, this is a man who went from working for Jesse Helms to working for Clinton and designed his re-election strategy. So I think that really does lay the closet liberal thing to rest. More than that, though, this is the sort of person. I used, when I was at school, to be able to grow watercress on my sponge. It was a thing we were able to do at boarding school. If you let your sponge rot for long enough, you could grow watercress on it. In the absolute decay and debauchery of American politics, and the takeover of it by soft money and spin doctoring, a certain kind of culture will grow in that grubby dish, and this type is the sort of thing we get. And he has more influence on the way elections are run and the way this president thinks than any 10 senators.
In his words, Dick Morris's words on President Clinton, we'll read the quote here, New York Times. What Clinton does is what any good sailor does. He tacks. The wind is blowing this way, so he goes toward the exit sign, but he goes like this way, and then it's blowing this way, so he shifts his sails and he goes that way. He's still working his way toward the exit sign, but he's not being an idiot about it. And then he goes a little this way and a little that way, and he ends up where he wants to go.
It's passes for political wisdom. It's just drivel. For one thing, there's no exit sign when you're sailing. I mean, people think, oh, what a masterly nautical metaphor. The guy's a complete idiot. But there's no such thing as disgrace anymore. There's no such thing as humiliation. There's no such thing as shame. All there is either celebrity or, at worst, notoriety. And this guy's the proof of it.
Down about 20...
makes you can hardly hold it down looking at a picture of that guy.
About 20 minutes left for the newspaper roundtable. Sarasota, Florida, you're next.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Couple things. One of them is we have people that make a conscious, fiscal responsible decision on how many children they should have. And they turn around and have to pay taxes for people that don't make that decision. There's also millions of people that want children that can't have them. Is there any thought to letting people that have the physical availability adopt children from people that can't afford them, that have them anyway?
David Fromm?
Kind of a redistributive scheme of children. Not a subject I've given a lot of thought to, I have to say. You
touch on abortion in your book?
I don't think so. Not in that one. I touched on it a little bit in the first and talked about its impact on the Republican Party. And it's been big, and but I think that the people I take very seriously the views of people who are anti-abortion. I think that they are. I mean, they are often represented as you know, they get a very bad press. I mean, compared to other political minorities. But you know, I think that the question of child poverty and why are there poor children is a separate question, really, from fertility. Fertility rates in America have been declining steeply over the past 30 years that the reason there are more poor children, the reason there are more abortions, is not because there are more children being born. In fact, there are many, many fewer children being born per woman than was the case 20 years ago when America seemed to do better, or 20 or 30 years ago when America seemed to do better by its more numerous, relatively more numerous children.
But I think our questioner was looking for an answer on adoption, not abortion, wasn't he? I mean, the tragic fact is that there are a lot of people who can't have children, and it must be awful for them. I often think, reading stories are all about abortion, thinking, oh, there are people who could have a child and don't want to. It increases their misery. I was the sponsor once of an adoption for a childless couple. You have to get people to say you're okay and you can pay the bills and so on, and they flattered me by asking me to be one of their sponsors. What amazed me was how much they were perfectly solvent and professional and responsible, and they met all the tests very easily, but they had the devil's own job getting hold of a child they could raise. And what struck me was how much this business is controlled by the churches. It's very, very hard to get hold of a child looking for a home unless you have some confessional way into doing it. And I can't believe that there couldn't be a better national adoption service method of matching people who want to give a child away to those who would love to make a home for one. Can't believe we can't do better than this.
Let's go to L.A. Got another call from there.
Hi, I wanted to draw your attention to a front page story in the LA Times yesterday concerning Arizona's Prop 200, concerning the de facto legalization of a series of illicit drugs. Much of the attention has been focused on 215 in California, which was the Medical Marijuana Act. They're claiming in this article that the Arizona initiative is going to be a model for drug legalization throughout the entire United States. And since it was passed by 2 out of 3 Arizonans as a similar number of Californians on a similar subject, I was wondering if the gentleman could comment.
Well,
Take it away.
I have to say I'm a heretic on this question. I think it makes a lot of sense, at least for the less serious drugs. You know, one of the things that I've always been given to understand about why the homicide rate in Washington, D.C. was so much higher than it is in almost any other American city, even cities with the 350 homicides last year, which is considered a great achievement. It's down from 500 half a dozen years ago, is that in Washington the drug trade has always been completely disorganized. In New York and Philadelphia and Chicago there are criminal syndicates, but still syndicates that understand who has control of the channels of drug distribution. In Washington, that's not been the case. You have these open-air drug markets. It's a very lucrative trade, and people get butchered over it. And I have to think it would be better for everybody if you took this trade out of the hands of criminal syndicates, put it into the hands of respectable companies that Democratic presidential candidates could demagogue against at election time, the evil tobacco marijuana complex, but ensure that it was regularized, that the level of profit in the industry came down, and that it wasn't worthwhile to butcher people over it. Yes, you would have a rise in addiction. I have no doubt about that. You'd have a fall in the murder rate. I think that would be a fair trade. That's a very heretical thought nowadays, but I think it would be a good trade.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm very heartened to find that, in spite of all the incessant, ridiculous, hateful, self-evidently contradictory propaganda about the war on drugs, that when American voters are asked about it, it shows this propaganda has had no effect. It really cheers me up to think that. It restores one's faith in the thinking voter. I think decriminalization of drugs is long, long overdue. It will be looked back on when it is done as what was all that about? How did we let Richard Nixon declare a war on drugs and ruin so much of our society, throw away so many of our liberties, incarcerate so many innocent people, deny ourselves, in the case of marijuana, so many potential remedies? How did we ever let this prohibition go as far as it has gone? I would add to what David Frum says, that not just would there be a great decline in the murder rate, because I'm not threatened physically at all if someone in my building or on my block wants to put a substance into their system, which is their right and it's none of the government's business. That doesn't threaten me at all. What does threaten me is the people who will shoot at each other in the street for the right to sell him that stuff if it's illegal. The second thing that terrible consequence, fell consequence that arises from that is, of course, tremendous corruption. Whole police departments have been lost to the drug trade, and I think it won't be long before there'll be judges too. It'll be much, much worse than Chicago in the 20s, and it already is pretty bad. I think that's the moment probably at which decriminalization will be considered forcibly by the authorities. They'll have to do something about it. But I think it's appalling one should have to wait that long.
Let's go out to Columbus, Ohio. Good morning.
Yes, I'm a first-time caller, and hopefully I won't get so nervous that I will sound like a blithering idiot here.
Welcome.
But I'm always struck by how poor the concept is of what it is to be poor. Having been there, and certainly all of my childhood, I was probably poorer than even the poorest in the inner city. I'm really struck by what people think that it really is like.
Well, let's get a definition from each of our guests. How do you define poor?
Yeah, I'm not sure I exactly understand the caller's question. I would define poverty as someone who, in a rural area, has a family income of less than $10,000, and in a city has a family income of less than $15,000.
Well, actually, that would have been very wealthy for the standard that I grew up in. And Mr. Hitchens particularly, when he said he didn't feel that they could grow up to be a good parent, etc., I want to say that it has nothing to do with money. It only has to do with character. And fortunately, even though if you took my childhood and put it on the scale, it would have met the very worst circumstances. But I had a mother who was very bright and who had character. And those are the concepts, more than money, that we really need.
The poor are different from us, as Scott Fitzgerald famously said. They have less money. I don't think you can, in fact, put a figure on it, because the definition must, I think, mean that if you're poor, it means you are not sure when your next meal is going to be, and you're not certain that you know where you're going to sleep, or you're not secure in your habitation. I think that's to be absolutely poor. Is to not have any confidence in the availability of the bare necessities. Of course it is true, as the lady says, for herself and by implication for others, that many people have triumphed over upbringings of that kind, and we know their stories. We partly know them, of course, because they're the survivors. There are people who didn't make it. And my point about people later on becoming poor parents, to use poor in another way, ma'am, was actually directed to what David Frum was saying about the relationship between poverty, malnutrition, and intelligence. I mean, it's been shown that children who are badly malnourished in their early days will have lower IQs, for example. So that doesn't, of course, a low IQ doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to be a good parent, but you know what I mean. The odds tend to lengthen at about that point.
Time to get in a couple more calls. Let's go to Buffalo first. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. A comment and a question. The comment relates to Mr. Frum and the Canadian healthcare system. I live up here in Buffalo, and it's about a 5-minute drive from Canada. And I would challenge Mr. Frum to come up with the name of one major Canadian politician who has suggested politically that they abandon the national health care system that he condemns so much for anything that we have down here. But my real question is this, perhaps for both gentlemen. Why does Mr. Clinton, who now has been reelected for 4 more years, can't run again, why can't he operate from the gut instead of continuing to have his finger up to the political wind to see which way it's blowing?
Well, I'll leave that second question to Christopher Hitchens, who probably has keener insights than I into the president's psychology. As to the first, why has no Canadian politician called for the abandonment of a system that is demonstrably now failing? Why does no American politician acknowledge that Social Security is in danger of going bankrupt? I mean, there are things that, the mere fact that something is true doesn't mean that it is safe politically to say. And in Canada, the two things. One is that the problems of the healthcare system have been intensifying over the past half-dozen years. It actually did work, although the inevitability of some kind of crisis was there from the beginning. It worked reasonably well until 6 or 7 years ago. It's begun to go wrong since then. And second, that for Canadians, of course, as the caller in Buffalo will know, the healthcare system has significance way, way beyond whether it's doing a good job or not. It's an important touchstone of national identity. And at this point, to acknowledge to acknowledge in Canada that the healthcare system is false, is the equivalent in the United States of acknowledging that the flag could be more beautiful. It's just something you don't say.
Give you a chance for one more comment. You mentioned, we've been talking about the president. You mentioned soft money earlier and campaign. One story we didn't get to bring up, but we'll bring up real quick here, is the White House is considering whether to open fundraisers attended by the president to the news media as a response to the public furor over questionable campaign money. They talk about potential...
How much do they have to pay to attend?
Well, they talk about potential problems with the dynamics of those meetings.
Well, that drives me wild with annoyance, because during the actual election campaign, when it would have been worth knowing and worth attending, I couldn't even get the Democratic National Committee to tell me which fundraisers the president had already attended. They considered that to be their private business, as indeed it was. But if I'd rung up and offered them money, they would have given me a straight answer and perhaps an invitation. But if I didn't have any money, they weren't interested. The franchising of politics and the sort of people to whom it's been franchised, like these real sweeties in Indonesia, is the scandal of the moment. And the scandal, as my friend Mike Kinsley once put it so well in Washington, is never what's illegal. The scandal is what's legal.
Last thought?
I am amused by the, I mean, there's the Dick Morris rule again. We asked, did he make a comeback? There it is. You issue your pro forma apology and then refuse ever again to acknowledge that anything went wrong. And then change the subject and say what we now need, of course, is a vast new regulatory statute.
It's always great to hear from both of you, David Frum from the Manhattan Institute and Christopher Hitchens of Vanity Fair. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
And we'll be back in a couple minutes.
And I think that it may be a distinction without a difference to suggest that one is a cultural and one is a social cause of misery among our children.
Actually, but family breakup seems to be bigger than that there were 7.5 million children altogether born out of wedlock in the United States last year. Many of them to non-poor people. I agree with Christopher Hitchens. This is maybe one of the top 2 or 3 things that Americans should be worrying about. I mean, that a quarter of the country's children are growing up poor, and as Christopher Hitchens says, that means that they're never going to be as tall. That means they're never going to be as clever because they're not fed properly when they're young. I mean, it has huge implications for the society. And
they're not going to be very good parents either.
And they're not going to be very good parents.
Let's get some more issues and more articles on the table here, but first we want to re-invite the viewers to phone in with their questions, comments, anything they're seeing in their papers around the country. We'll put the split lines on the screen again for you. Talk for a couple more minutes and then start taking your phone calls. Our guests this morning are David Frum, who is the author of this book right here. It's titled What's Right? Came out earlier this year, right? How's it doing?
It's doing actually not too bad. I say that with sort of a pleasant surprise. I always expect that these things are going to vanish without a trace. But it seems to be selling in its niche reasonably briskly.
I prefer the title of the last one, I must say. Which was, by the way, Dead Right.
That's right.
And Christopher,
which I always kept hoping would be more prescient than it actually was.
Now you, Christopher Hitchens, just got back from overseas.
I did.
Where were you and why did you go?
Well, actually, it's not all that... last week, just before Thanksgiving, I was in Cyprus. Coming at least a year ago is the implosion of the Mobutu regime in Zaire. Probably the worst regime in probably the richest, potentially most successful country in Africa. And once again, very much United States responsibility. General Mobutu was imposed upon Zaire by the Central Intelligence Agency a long time ago. He and his army and his appalling regime are our business. And they've got a very short time now, I would say, to live, or to survive. Live in the case of Mobutu because he's dying of cancer, and survive in the case of the regime because it is a one-man despotism, and its army is trained only to fight its own civilians, and is now gradually collapsing in the eastern provinces as the rebels get nearer the capital. If I was Mr. Anthony Lake, I would be calling urgent briefings at my new CIA to find out what went wrong, and begin the inquest now.
Stay overseas just for a minute here. Actually, it's the Chinese defense minister was in town yesterday, made a speech, got a pretty decent amount of coverage. Front page in the Washington Times here. This gentleman defended the 1989 attack on Tiananmen Square and actually claimed no one was killed in the bloody confrontation, as he points out here. Any response to what you've seen?
It's all a big misunderstanding. I have to say that I would, if I were a front page editor, I would not put Chinese, I would not regard Chinese communist thinks it's okay to kill people as a front page story. That strikes me as a dog bites man story. If you found a Chinese communist who thought it wasn't okay to kill people, that would be a front page story.
I'm amazed at
We have an hour here with two guests who are rejoining us here. We're going to talk with Christopher Hitchens of Vanity Fair. Good morning.
Morning.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
And we're going to talk with David Frum, an author and a member of the Manhattan Institute. Good morning to you.
Thank you.
What are you reading today?
Well, the first story that caught my eye was the story that was in both the Washington Post and the Washington Times. A team of Columbia University researchers has come up with some disturbing findings about the rising incidence of child poverty. This is one of these stories that is a profound trend in American life, but somehow never seems newsworthy enough to actually break through the usual noise of the broad trends. Here's what they found. The percentage of children in poverty is up sharply over the past 20 years, and the numbers here are probably better than statistics. That in 1975 there were 3.5 million children living in poverty, and today there are 6 million children living in poverty. Now what's striking, and the reason to look at both stories, is that the two newspapers implicitly give, the Washington Post and the Washington Times, different explanations of why this is so. And in a way...
This is the Times story we're looking at, by the way.
Okay. And in a way it sort of sums up a lot of the ideological debate in America about what is going wrong with the country. The Washington Post story follows the Columbia researchers in believing that the main problem is the declining rate of pay. At least that's available to the less skilled, that it's more difficult for less skilled people to find work, so they are poor and therefore their children are poor. The Washington Times story emphasizes that it's family status that has everything to do with it, that of the children who are poor, only 8% of poor children live with a married mother and father.
Which I think is a very important subject, very much off the American radar screen at the moment, but I predict about to come back. The situation in Cyprus is deteriorating, I believe. The overall rivalry between Greece and Turkey is intensifying, but the situation in Cyprus itself is intensifying independently. The Turkish position is becoming much harder. They've just adopted what I would describe as a shoot-to-kill policy against people who protest against the Turkish partition of the island. 3 people were killed over the summer in cold blood as a result. And it's one of those stories that everyone feels they know and has been filed away on the... Actually, you can't file something on a back burner, can you? But you know what I mean. Has been stored. And looked like a permanent petrified stalemate, but in fact the stalemate is becoming unstable. And so I went to have a look at that and try and update my book on the subject.
And you mentioned that it's sort of a small arms build-up among 2 NATO countries.
Yes, there's a local arms race going on, which should concern your viewers probably more than it does, in that the United States is the principal supplier of heavy weaponry to both sides. Both of the rivals in this case are members of the NATO alliance, and the United States, as the biggest exporter of military hardware around the world, is the armorer of both. In fact, it also ought to be better known, in my opinion, that Turkey violates the United States Foreign Assistance Act by using aid and military material given to it for its own defense for the occupation and colonization of northern Cyprus.
And we know you have an article that you brought to the table here out of Zaire this morning. What's on your mind?
Yes, sorry still to keep people overseas, but another thing that surprises me, because it's a thing one could have seen.
92% live either with parents who are living together common law, which is usually a very short-term arrangement, or in single-parent households. And so that you've got the statistical evidence, the facts right there, to come up with whichever view you like. Is that child poverty is a result of changes in the labor market? Child poverty is the result of changes in American family structure.
Christopher Hitchens, I'll give you a chance to respond to that, and you have a different interest this morning as well.
Got to be said that there's something superficially plausible about shortage of money as an explanation for poverty, though, I think. I mean, I've always felt, I mean, and given all the I won't give it its right name, all the nonsense talked about family values, or the incessant stress placed on them, it is still a pretty amazing reproach that the number of children living in absolute poverty should be going up in the way that it has done. In in Sweden a few years ago, the country I think probably most disliked by the American right, maybe even more than Cuba, I sometimes think, it was found that you could take a child out of a class in any school at random and run the ruler over it, its teeth, its skin, its calcium, rate of growth, and all that kind of thing. And having run the ruler over it, you could make no guess at all about the social class or occupation of its parents. That's what I would call a social democratic achievement. Imagine how far one is in America from being able to do that. You can tell more or less at a glance what the social class or origins of a lot of people are. Just a thought. I must say I don't think it's necessarily an antithesis what you put forward at the opening, because poverty is very often a cause of family breakup, as is joblessness among males.